All right, so let's jump into a deep dive today. And today's source material is an editorial from The Hindu. And this one's going to be especially useful to all of our UPSC aspirants out there.
Definitely a timely one.
Yeah, so we're going to be looking at India's constitution, specifically at its 75th anniversary.
75 years, that's quite a milestone.
It is. And we're not just going to be looking back at history, though. We're really going to try to dig into some of the issues that are shaping India today and looking ahead, to the future a little bit.
Makes sense. You can't really understand where you're going without knowing where you've been. Right?
Exactly. And that's what makes the Constitution such a fascinating document. It's like a roadmap for India's journey as a nation.
Absolutely. And for our listeners who are prepping for the UPSC exams, this deep dive is going to be like your cheat sheet for both mains and prelims. We're going to be hitting both the analytical understanding and the key facts you need to know.
So get those notebooks ready. Now, one of the things that really struck me about the editorial is how it talks about the Constitution as this balancing act.
It really is. On the one hand, you have this incredibly diverse nation with distinct regions and demands for autonomy. And on the other, there's the need for a strong central government to hold it all together.
Right. And the editorial uses this term, quasi-federalism, to describe India's system. What exactly does that mean?
So quasi-federalism, it means that India doesn't fit neatly into either category, right? It's not purely federal like the U.S., where states have a lot of autonomy.
Right.
And it's not purely unitary like, say, France, where the central government holds most of the power. India kind of sits somewhere in between on a spectrum.
Leaning more towards a strong center, though, right?
You could say that. The Constitution definitely gives the central government significant powers, especially in areas like defense and foreign policy. But it also recognizes the need for states to have their own sphere of governance. So, this balancing act has actually led to some pretty interesting debates and challenges over the years.
Like the whole debate around the governor's role, for instance.
Ah, yes, the governor.
The editorial mentions that governors are supposed to be neutral, but they often end up causing friction between the center and the states. So what's going on there? Why is that?
Well, ideally, the governor acts as a bridge between the state and the central government. They're there to ensure that the Constitution is being upheld at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
But because governors are appointed by the central government, there's often this perception, especially from opposition parties in the state, that the governor is acting more as an agent of the center.
So it's like almost like a conflict of interest built right into the system.
In a way, yes. And this perception of bias can lead to all sorts of tensions, especially when you have different parties in power at the state and central levels. It's definitely something our UPSC folks should keep in mind, as it often comes up in current affairs discussions, and even in mains answer writing.
And then there's the debate about simultaneous elections for the Lok Sabha and the state assemblies. The argument is that it could help streamline things, but doesn't that also raise some concerns about, potentially upsetting that balance of power between the center and the states even more?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the idea behind simultaneous elections, on the surface, it sounds pretty good, right? It could save money and reduce the disruption caused by having elections all the time, and maybe even lead to more stable governments.
Sure.
Shadowing important regional issues, and make state elections all about national politics rather than the specific concerns of that state.
Yeah, especially in a country as diverse as India. I mean, each state has its own unique challenges and priorities, right?
Exactly. And if state elections become all about who's in power at the center, those local issues might get lost in the noise.
Which would not be great for regional representation.
Not at all. Imagine a scenario where you have a really charismatic prime minister leading a popular national party. Now, if Lok Sabha and state assembly elections happen at the same time, that prime minister's popularity could sway voters in the state elections as well, even if they might prefer a different party to govern their state.
And wouldn't that make it even harder for smaller regional parties to hold their own?
Absolutely. So, it's not just a procedural change. It has some serious implications for how power is distributed in India. Definitely something for our UPSC aspirants to ponder.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of power dynamics, the editorial also touches on the whole issue of linguistic diversity. I mean, India has so many languages, each with its own cultural and political weight, right?
It does. It's incredible.
So how does the Constitution navigate that?
Well, it recognizes Hindi and English as official languages for the union government, but it also acknowledges the importance of regional languages.
Right.
But of course, it's not without its controversies. We've seen movements pushing for the recognition and protection of regional languages, especially in the South. And a lot of this stems from concerns about Hindi being imposed on non-Hindi speaking states.
Ah, so it kind of ties into that bigger question of how to maintain national unity while also respecting regional identities.
Exactly. Language is so deeply connected to culture and identity, right? If
Mm,
people feel like their language is being sidelined, it can lead to a sense of alienation and resentment. It's a delicate balance.
absolutely. And a balance that India has been grappling with for decades. So we've got these tensions between the center and the states, between linguistic groups. Is there anything else that kind of adds fuel to the fire?
Well, let's not forget about the money, specifically how financial resources are shared between the center and the states. This is where things can get really tricky.
You're talking about fiscal federalism, right?
Exactly. And the GST, the goods and services tax, is a prime example of how contentious this can get.
The editorial mentions delayed GST compensation payments. How does that factor into all of this?
Well, the GST was supposed to simplify the tax system and create a more unified market, but some states argue that they're actually losing out on revenue, and they were supposed to be compensated for those losses, at least initially.
Right. Yeah.
But when the central government delays those payments, it creates distrust and resentment. It feeds into that perception that the center is trying to exert more control over the state's finances.
So it's yet another layer of complexity in this whole debate about federalism in India.
It really is. And it shows how deeply intertwined these issues of finance, autonomy, and power dynamics are.
It's like a constant tug of war, isn't it?
It is. And for anyone trying to understand Indian politics or preparing for the UPSC exams, getting a grasp on these dynamics is absolutely essential. And then you throw something like the delimitation exercise into the mix.
Yes, the delimitation exercise.
Yeah.
This is where the government redraws the boundaries of constituencies. Right. Based on population changes.
Right, exactly. Seems pretty straightforward on the surface, but
It does. But the editorial mentions that some states are actually worried about losing representation in parliament because of this. Why is that?
well, think about it this way. If a state has been really successful in implementing population control measures, their population growth might be slower than other states, right?
Right.
So when constituencies are redrawn based on the latest census data, that state could end up with fewer seats in parliament, even though they've done a good job managing population growth.
It's like they're being punished for doing the right thing, in a way.
It does seem a bit unfair, doesn't it? And this has raised concerns about whether the delimitation process could end up penalizing states that have been more successful in controlling population growth.
That's like a real catch-22.
Yeah.
So it seems like Indian federalism is constantly being pulled in these different directions, but, it's held up for 75 years. So something must be working, right?
It really is remarkable. The Indian Constitution has shown remarkable resilience, adapting to changing circumstances, navigating all these competing demands. And we can't forget the role of the judiciary in all of this. The Supreme Court has consistently upheld federalism as a core principle of the Constitution. They've often acted as a check on the central government's power, ensuring that the state's interests are protected.
So even with all of these challenges and tensions, there are safeguards in place.
Absolutely. It's a system designed for checks and balances. Now, moving on to individual liberties, the editorial also talks about how they intersect with all of these complexities of Indian society.
Right, and it specifically mentions laws like the UAPA, the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act, and the PMLA, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act.
Those are two big ones that are often in the news.
They are. So what are some of the main points of contention around these laws?
Well, critics argue that while these laws are intended to address serious issues, right, terrorism, financial crime, things like that, they're often misused to stifle dissent and target individuals without sufficient evidence.
So it's a question of balancing security concerns with individual rights.
Exactly. The UAPA, for instance, allows for detention without trial for really long periods, and it's been used against activists, journalists, even students.
That's pretty concerning. And the PMLA, what are some of the criticisms around that law?
Well, the PMLA has been criticized for having a very broad definition of what constitutes money laundering.
Okay.
So it can be used to target a wide range of financial transactions, even those that might not actually involve any criminal activity.
It sounds like it could be quite a slippery slope.
It can be. And it raises concerns about due process and the right to a fair trial.
So how do you strike that balance between national security and individual liberties? It's a tough question, isn't it?
It really is, and there's no easy answer. For a UPSC aspirant, it's important to understand both sides of the argument. You might be asked to analyze a case study, for example, that involves the UAPA or the PMLA.
Right.
And you need to be able to present a balanced perspective, taking into account legal precedents, the potential for misuse, and all of those nuances.
That's a crucial point. It's not just about knowing the laws, it's about understanding how they function in practice.
Absolutely. It's about the real-world application and the debates surrounding these laws.
And speaking of real-world implications, we can't talk about individual liberties without addressing the issue of caste in India.
Absolutely. Caste is deeply intertwined with the promise of equality that's enshrined in the Constitution.
It is. The editorial highlights this and points out that despite constitutional safeguards, caste-based discrimination is still a persistent problem.
It is. It's a stark reminder that legal frameworks alone aren't enough to dismantle these deeply ingrained social hierarchies.
It's a complex issue. So how does the Constitution attempt to address the issue of caste?
Well, the Constitution, it abolishes untouchability right off the bat, and it guarantees equality before the law.
Right.
It also provides for affirmative action through reservations in education and employment for historically disadvantaged caste groups. But the reality is that, social attitudes and practices often lag behind legal reforms.
So it's a constant battle to try to bridge that gap between the ideals of the Constitution and the realities on the ground.
Exactly. And this is another area where our UPSC folks need to really delve deep. Understanding the historical context, the evolution of legislation and policies, and the ongoing debates surrounding caste is crucial for both mains and prelims.
It's a topic that comes up again and again in the UPSC syllabus.
It does, because it's such a fundamental aspect of Indian society.
Now, and it's not just about caste, right? Economic inequalities are also widening in India. The editorial talks about this growing gap between the rich and the poor and the unequal access to opportunities.
Yes, it's a major challenge, and it undermines the very foundation of a just society.
Right.
The Constitution talks about justice, social, economic, and political, but when you have such a massive gap between the haves and the have-nots, it really makes you question how meaningful those guarantees are for a large segment of the population.
Because if people don't have access to basic necessities, education, healthcare, how can they meaningfully participate in the democratic process?
Exactly. Or contribute to the nation's progress.
So it's a fundamental challenge to the very vision of an egalitarian society that the Constitution is trying to create.
It is, and it's something that policymakers are constantly grappling with.
And we also can't forget about gender inequality.
Yeah.
The editorial touches on this as well. Even with constitutional guarantees of equality, women in India still face significant challenges.
Right, they do. Despite the legal provisions, women continue to face discrimination in so many areas. Access to education, employment, political representation, and even just basic safety and security.
It's a multifaceted problem.
It is, and a lot of it is rooted in deeply patriarchal social norms and attitudes.
So it's not just about changing laws, it's about changing mindsets.
Exactly. And that's a much more complex and long-term undertaking, but it's essential for creating a truly equitable society.
It really is. So, we've been talking about all these different issues: federalism, individual liberties, social and economic inequalities, and it's clear that they're all interconnected.
They are. It's like we've been peeling back these layers of complexity, revealing how these different challenges are all intertwined, right?
Exactly. And it makes you realize that the Indian Constitution isn't just some static document. It's a reflection of India's evolving journey as a nation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And at 75, that journey is at a crossroads.
Because the editorial mentions something pretty radical, calls to replace the Constitution altogether. That's a big deal. What's driving that sentiment?
Well, some argue that the Constitution, as it stands, it's too Western in its outlook.
Okay.
That it doesn't adequately reflect India's unique cultural and historical ethos.
Interesting. So they're advocating for a more, like an Indic constitution?
Exactly. A constitution that's rooted in Indian traditions and values.
But wouldn't that be incredibly difficult to define? I mean, India is so diverse, so many different traditions and beliefs.
It would be a massive undertaking, and there's no guarantee that everyone would agree on what an Indic constitution should look like.
Right. So you've got some pushing for a completely new constitution, while others believe that the existing one, with all its flaws, still provides a solid foundation for a just and democratic India.
Exactly. It's a debate that's likely to continue for a long time.
It is. And for our UPSC aspirants, it's crucial to understand the arguments on both sides of this debate. You might be asked to write an essay on this very topic, so being well-versed in the different perspectives is key.
Absolutely. It's about more than just theoretical knowledge, though. It's about understanding how these debates play out in the real world, how they shape policy decisions, and ultimately how they impact people's lives.
It's about connecting the dots between those constitutional principles, legal frameworks, social realities, and the political dynamics at play.
Exactly. That's what makes the study of the Indian Constitution so relevant, not just for exams, but for anyone who wants to understand India today.
It really is fascinating, isn't it? The
Yeah.
more you delve into the Indian Constitution, the more you realize there's always something more to learn, another layer to peel back, you know?
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's what makes it such an engaging area of study. It's not just about memorizing articles and amendments, right? It's about understanding the spirit of the Constitution, the vision that the framers had, and how it continues to shape India today.
And speaking of the framers, the editorial brings up B.R. Ambedkar and his warnings about, well, about the future of Indian democracy. His
Yeah.
words still resonate so strongly today, even 75 years later. Why is that, do you think?
Well, you have to remember that Ambedkar, while he was the architect of the Constitution, he was also one of its most insightful critics.
Right.
He wasn't naive to the potential pitfalls, the challenges that lay ahead, and he was very vocal about those concerns. Like he warned against hero worship, the dangers of blindly following any leader without question.
So he was already advocating for a more critical, engaged citizenry back then.
Oh, absolutely. He recognized that the Constitution was a framework, right? A set of guidelines. But its success ultimately depended on the people, on us. He believed that citizens had a responsibility to hold their leaders accountable, to question decisions, and to actively participate in the democratic process.
And if you think about it, those ideas are even more relevant today
Hmm.
in our current political climate. It's like he could see the challenges that were coming.
He did, and he also cautioned against the dangers of social and economic inequality. He saw that as a major threat to the stability of any democracy, which sadly is something we're seeing play out around the world today.
And that brings us back to a lot of the issues we've been discussing today, right? The widening gap between the rich and poor, the persistence of caste-based discrimination, the challenges of gender inequality. These are the things that really undermine the idea of a just and equitable society.
They do. And if these issues aren't addressed in a meaningful way, they can easily lead to social unrest, political instability, and ultimately a weakening of democratic institutions. It's a dangerous cycle.
So what does it mean to be a constitutional guardian in contemporary India? It's clearly more than just knowing the laws.
It is. I think it's about upholding the values that underpin those laws, the values of justice, liberty, equality, and fraternity. It's about working towards creating a society that truly reflects those ideals.
So it's about being an active, informed, and engaged citizen,
Mm.
participating in the democratic process, holding leaders accountable, and fighting for a more just and equitable society. That's a pretty tall order.
It is. But it's also incredibly inspiring, isn't it? And for our UPSC aspirants out there, understanding all of this is crucial. It's not just about passing an exam, it's about preparing to serve the nation, to uphold the Constitution, and to navigate all the complexities of India's political and social landscape.
And there's no better place to start than with the source that sparked this whole conversation, that insightful editorial in The Hindu. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to understand the key issues facing India at 75.
I agree. It really does offer a great overview of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead. And it's a good reminder that the Constitution isn't some dusty old document, right? It's a living, breathing framework that's constantly being tested and reinterpreted.
Exactly. It's an ongoing conversation,
Yeah.
and we all have a role to play in shaping that conversation.
Well said. And on that note, we're going to wrap up our deep dive into India at 75 and its constitutional crossroads. It's been quite a journey.
It has. But remember, folks, the conversation doesn't end here. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep those minds curious. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with your fellow knowledge seekers. Until next time.